The romance of the Middle Ages versus the harsh reality. When you hear the term medieval peasant, what do you imagine? Rolling green fields, a humble cottage, and a simple life close to nature. Maybe a hard-working farmer with dirt on his hands and peace in his heart. This romantic image of the past is surprisingly persistent. In fact, some people even claim that peasants in the Middle Ages had more free time, fewer worries, and healthier food than modern people. But what if we told you that much of that is a myth? Welcome to a deep dive into the real life of medieval peasants, a life that, in many ways, was far worse than we usually imagine. This isn't just about dirt floors and bad teeth. It's about a system designed to keep people poor, powerless, and constantly on the edge of survival. Forget fairy tales. This is the history they don't show you in movies. In this video, we're going to explore the day-to-day existence of the average peasant in medieval Europe, their work, their homes, their food, their rights, or lack thereof, and yes, their income. We'll also look at how their lives compare to ours today. Spoiler, that simple life wasn't so peaceful after all. But first, let's be clear. Who were these peasants exactly? Not all peasants were the same. Some were serfs, legally tied to the land and owned by lords. Others were slightly freer, villains or freemen, but still trapped in a rigid feudal hierarchy. Whatever their status, most shared a common reality: hard labor, heavy taxes, little autonomy, and a life expectancy shockingly low by today's standards. So why do we still romanticize this era? Why do some people imagine the past as somehow better, cleaner, or more natural? The truth, as you'll soon see, is much darker and far more fascinating. Let's begin. Food and diet. Was the medieval peasant well-fed? One of the biggest misconceptions about medieval peasants is that they ate simple but healthy organic food, free from preservatives, chemicals, and artificial ingredients. Sounds ideal, right? But the truth is far from appetizing. The average medieval peasant's diet was heavily restricted by seasons, crop yields, social class, and sheer availability. Most meals revolved around bread, not the fluffy white loaves we know today, but dense, coarse loaves made from rye, barley, or oats. White wheat bread was a luxury reserved for the wealthy. Peasants rarely saw it. Meat? That was a rare treat. Most peasants might only eat pork or beef a few times a year, usually on religious holidays or during feasts sponsored by the local lord. Chickens were more common, but they were usually kept for eggs, not slaughtered. The main source of protein came from legumes when available, or dairy, if the household was lucky enough to own a cow or goat. Fresh fruits and vegetables were seasonal and often unavailable during the winter months. Root vegetables like onions, leeks, and turnips were more common, but lacked essential vitamins. Malnutrition was common. Peasants often suffered from rickets, scurvy, and other deficiency-related illnesses, especially in years when the harvest failed. Food storage was another major problem. Without refrigeration, preserving food meant salting, smoking, drying, or fermenting, techniques that were time-consuming and not always effective. Spoiled or moldy food wasn't just gross, it could be deadly. And then there were famines. Medieval Europe experienced frequent crop failures. A few weeks of bad weather could devastate the harvest, causing hunger that might last for months. In the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, millions went hungry, and some resorted to eating bark, grass, or even worse. So, while it's easy to fantasize about a peasant's natural diet, the reality was grim. Limited variety, poor nutrition, seasonal starvation, and chronic hunger. Food wasn't just sustenance, it was a daily struggle. Eating enough to survive was, quite literally, a full-time concern. Income and economy. How much did a peasant really earn? So, how much did medieval peasants actually earn? Here's the catch. Many didn't earn money at all in the way we think of wages today. Most peasants worked under the feudal system, where income wasn't measured in coins, but in grain, livestock, and labor. And the little money they did touch was often whisked away by taxes, rents, and tithes. Let's break it down. Most peasants didn't own the land they worked. Instead, they rented it from a local lord, paying in crops, labor, called corvée, or cash, if they had any. On top of that, they owed the church a tithe, 10% of everything they produced, whether they could afford it or not. That's like giving up 10% of your food while barely feeding your own family. Some peasants, particularly free ones, might earn small wages working on other farms, building roads, or doing seasonal work. But even those jobs were limited, and competition was fierce. A day of labor might earn you a penny or two, which sounds quaint until you realize that a pair of shoes might cost several days' wages. A basic iron tool? Maybe a week's worth of work. Cash was scarce in the countryside. Most peasants operated in a barter economy, trading eggs for bread, wool for tools, labor for firewood. This made it nearly impossible to save, invest, or improve one's standard of living. Economic mobility? Practically non-existent. Let's put it into perspective. In modern terms, historians estimate that the effective annual income of a peasant in 14th century England was equivalent to less than $1,000 today. And that's before taxes, rent, and food. Now imagine living on that, feeding a family, enduring winter, and surviving famines. And yet, peasants still had to pay fines for minor offenses, fees to use the lord's mill or oven, and tolls if they wanted to travel. Every part of their lives had a cost, and someone else was always collecting. The idea that peasants lived simply and had few needs is misleading. They did have needs, they just couldn't afford to meet them. Their so-called simplicity was not a lifestyle choice. It was economic entrapment. Living conditions and health. What was daily life really like? If you think a peasant's home was a cozy little cottage with a thatched roof and a crackling fire, think again. The typical medieval peasant lived in a one-room house made of mud, straw, and wood, a fragile structure vulnerable to rain, fire, and pests. The floor, dirt, the walls, often filled with smoke, soot, and damp. There was no insulation, no chimney, and no privacy. In winter, the cold was relentless. Peasants relied on small hearth fires, but without chimneys, the smoke simply filled the room. It caused chronic respiratory problems, especially for children and the elderly. Windows were rare, and those that existed were just holes covered with cloth or wooden shutters. Daylight was precious. Candles were expensive. As for sanitation, it was practically non-existent. Most homes had no latrine. Waste was thrown into pits or nearby streams, contaminating the water supply. Disease spread rapidly. Lice, fleas, and intestinal parasites were common companions. Bathing was infrequent, not because peasants hated cleanliness, but because hot water and privacy were luxuries. A proper bathhouse? Only in cities, and even then, rarely accessible to the rural poor. Healthcare was a gamble. There were no trained doctors in villages. Most relied on folk remedies, herbs, and prayers. While some treatments had merit, many were based on superstition or religious beliefs rather than science. A toothache could turn into a deadly infection. Childbirth was incredibly risky for both mother and baby. Infant mortality was shockingly high. In some areas, more than 30% of children died before age 5. Even if you survived childhood, life remained brutal. By age 30, many peasants had lost most of their teeth, suffered from chronic pain, and were considered elderly. The average life expectancy was about 35 to 40 years, but that number drops significantly if you include the high death rates in infancy. So while modern life has its stresses, it's worth remembering. The average medieval peasant faced a daily fight for warmth, cleanliness, and survival. Their homes were not rustic havens. They were places of cold, smoke, and disease, a far cry from the pastoral fantasy. Labor and time. Did peasants really work less than us? There's a popular internet claim that medieval peasants worked less than modern people, that they toiled only 150 days a year and spent the rest of their time relaxing, feasting, or attending festivals. It's a comforting idea, especially in an age of burnout. But is it true? Not exactly. It's true that medieval calendars were filled with religious holidays. In theory, some peasants had over 50 days off a year. But these were rarely restful. Many holy days involved mandatory church attendance, long fasts, processions, and, ironically, even more labor, especially for women preparing food for communal gatherings. And even on feast days, animals still needed feeding, firewood still had to be gathered, and children still needed care. The work itself was grueling. Peasants didn't clock in at 9 and finish at 5. Their day began before sunrise and often ended after sunset, especially during peak agricultural seasons like planting and harvest. Summer days could stretch to 14 hours or more of backbreaking labor. Winter brought shorter days, but also hardship, gathering fuel, repairing tools, spinning wool, tending livestock. Barley, wheat, oats, flax, each crop had its own labor demands. Add to that the obligations to the local lord. Peasants were often required to spend several days a week working the lord's fields for free under the system of corvée labor. Their own land had to wait. Fail to meet those obligations, and you might be fined or worse. And let's not forget domestic work. Women's labor was constant: baking, brewing, spinning, mending, milking, childcare, hauling water. Children as young as 6 helped in the fields or tended animals. There was no weekend, no vacation, and certainly no retirement. So where does the myth of peasants barely working come from? Likely from selective readings of church calendars and wishful thinking. But the reality was a relentless cycle of toil, dictated by the sun, the seasons, and survival. Far from a life of leisure, peasant life was one of endurance, physically, mentally, and emotionally. Next time someone tells you medieval peasants had it easy, ask them if they'd like to plow a frozen field at dawn with nothing in their stomach but a crust of rye bread. Freedom and rights. Were peasants truly free? In modern society, we take certain freedoms for granted: the right to move, choose a profession, own property, speak freely. But what about medieval peasants? Were they just poor, or were they also unfree? For many, the answer is both. Most medieval peasants were part of a feudal system, a rigid hierarchy where land, labor, and loyalty were traded up and down the social ladder. At the bottom were serfs, who were not exactly slaves, but certainly not free. A serf couldn't leave the manor without permission. He couldn't marry outside the estate, change occupations, or sell property without his lord's approval. If the land was sold, the serfs went with it, like livestock. Above serfs were villeins and freemen who had slightly more rights, but were still entangled in layers of obligation. Villeins owed labor to their lords and were often tied to their land through legal and economic pressure. Freemen could technically move or own land, but most didn't have the means to do so. Legal protection? Minimal. Lords often served as judge, jury, and enforcer within their own manorial courts. A peasant could be fined, punished, or even physically beaten for minor infractions, like gathering firewood from the wrong part of the forest or failing to pay a fee. Appealing to a higher court was nearly impossible. Taxes and fines were everywhere. Want to use the Lord's mill? Pay a fee. Want to bake in the communal oven? Pay again. Want to marry? Another fee. Even widows had to pay to avoid being forcibly remarried to someone the Lord preferred. Every aspect of life was monetized and monitored. Occasionally, peasants rebelled, like in the famous Peasants' Revolt of 1381 in England. But these uprisings were brutally crushed, and any gains were short-lived. The system was designed to keep peasants in their place, uneducated, dependent, and obedient. So, were peasants free? Technically, some were. But in practice, their lives were controlled by others, economically, legally, and socially. They lived under constant scrutiny, with little recourse if wronged, and no real path to upward mobility. Freedom wasn't just rare in the medieval world, it was a privilege reserved for the few. For the average peasant, life was not only hard, but tightly constrained by rules they didn't write and couldn't escape. Education, culture, and leisure. Was there room for joy or growth? When we picture medieval peasants, it's easy to assume they lived lives entirely consumed by survival, with no time for thought, creativity, or joy. But while life was harsh, peasants were still human. They laughed, sang, told stories, and found moments of meaning amid the grind. The tragedy is not that joy was absent, but that opportunity for growth was almost completely denied. Let's start with education. Literacy was rare. Most peasants could not read or write. Books were prohibitively expensive, and schools, where they existed, were usually run by the church and intended for boys of higher classes. Girls were almost entirely excluded. A peasant child's education was usually limited to learning farm work from their parents. Formal learning? Not even a dream. This lack of literacy meant peasants were vulnerable to manipulation. Legal documents, land records, even religious texts were beyond their reach. They relied on priests or local officials to interpret the world for them. Their knowledge was oral, passed down through stories, songs, and folklore, rich in meaning but limited in scope. Yet culture still thrived in its own way. Storytelling around the hearth, communal songs during harvest, dances on feast days. These were vital emotional outlets. Folklore, superstition, and seasonal festivals shaped the rhythm of peasant life. Music was played on simple instruments, and some villages developed their own local customs, traditions, and legends. Leisure was rare, but not non-existent. Games, mock tournaments, and wrestling matches were popular during festivals. Traveling minstrels or peddlers might bring news and novelty. Religious holidays, while filled with rituals, also offered moments of community and celebration. Alehouses served as informal social hubs, though for many, drinking was a way to briefly escape the weight of daily suffering. But cultural expression was constrained. Most peasants would never see a cathedral, hear a formal sermon in Latin, or engage with the broader intellectual world. The Renaissance, the debates of scholars, the growth of universities, all happened far above their heads. Their role was not to question or create, but to endure. So yes, peasants laughed, sang, and even loved. But joy existed despite the system, not because of it. Opportunities for intellectual growth or self-fulfillment were few and fragile, flickers of humanity in a world that offered little room for personal development. Comparing then and now, are we really better off today? After exploring the harsh realities of medieval peasant life, it's natural to wonder, how do we really compare? Are we truly better off today, or are we just trapped in different struggles? Let's start with the obvious. Modern life offers incredible advances. Longer lifespans, improved health care, abundant food, education for all, and fundamental freedoms. Most people today live in insulated homes, have access to clean water, and enjoy leisure time that medieval peasants could only dream of. Medieval peasants faced chronic hunger, disease, hard labor, legal bondage, and near total lack of personal freedom. The average life expectancy was less than half of what it is now in developed countries. Childhood mortality rates were staggering. Simple comforts like privacy, sanitation, and consistent nutrition were luxuries, not basics. Economically, today's global economy provides opportunities for some. Yes, poverty and inequality still exist, but even the poorest today have access to technologies, medicines, and social services unimaginable in the Middle Ages. But, and this is important, life today is not without its own challenges. Modern stresses include mental health issues, fast-paced lifestyles, job insecurity, and environmental crises. Unlike medieval peasants, many modern people face different kinds of pressures, such as information overload and social isolation. Still, comparing the two eras side by side, the evidence is clear. We are, on average, better off in terms of health, freedom, and material comfort. The brutal physical toil, constant threat of famine, and legal restrictions that defined medieval peasant life have largely disappeared. However, romanticizing the past ignores the brutal realities that millions endured. When some say life was simpler then, they often mean life was slower or less complicated. But simplicity came at a terrible cost. Understanding this contrast helps us appreciate how far human societies have come, and reminds us why basic rights, education, and healthcare matter so deeply. So yes, medieval peasants were worse off than we usually think. But their story also makes us reflect on what better really means today, and how we can continue to improve life for everyone, everywhere. The legacy of medieval peasants, how their lives shaped our world. Despite their hardships, medieval peasants left a lasting impact that still influences our world today. Their lives, struggles, and gradual pushes for freedom laid the groundwork for many social, economic, and political changes that shaped modern society. First, the medieval peasantry was the backbone of the feudal economy. Without their labor, Europe's agricultural output would have collapsed. Their hard work on the land sustained cities, nobility, and the church alike. Over centuries, their efforts helped stabilize food supplies and allowed populations to grow, setting the stage for urbanization and economic expansion. Moreover, peasants' gradual resistance to oppressive feudal controls sparked important shifts. Peasant revolts, while often brutally suppressed, exposed the fragility of feudal power. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381 in England, for example, forced ruling elites to reconsider serfdom and labor obligations. Over time, many regions saw the decline of serfdom and the rise of tenant farming and wage labor, early steps toward modern labor rights. Culturally, peasants preserved and transmitted traditions, folklore, and language that would form the roots of national identities. Their oral storytelling, songs, and customs shaped the cultural fabric of Europe, influencing art, literature, and later nationalist movements. The peasant experience also highlighted the importance of land ownership and rights. The eventual spread of property laws and the notion of personal freedom grew partly from peasants' demands for control over their livelihoods. Lastly, the harsh realities of peasant life underscored the need for social safety nets. Medieval famines, epidemics, and poverty laid bare the consequences of extreme inequality, influencing later ideas about charity, public health, and social welfare. So, while the peasants' lives were often brutal and limited, their legacy is profound. They were not merely victims, but agents of change whose daily toil and quiet resistance helped transform medieval Europe into the modern world we know today. Conclusion: reassessing medieval peasant life and its lessons for us. As we've seen throughout this journey, the life of a medieval peasant was far harsher and more complex than popular imagination suggests. Far from the idyllic, simple existence often romanticized, it was a constant struggle against hunger, disease, hard labor, and oppressive social structures. Medieval peasants faced enormous challenges: limited diets, low incomes, poor living conditions, lack of freedom, and minimal access to education. Their lives were shaped by forces beyond their control: feudal lords, religious obligations, and a fragile ecosystem that could collapse with a bad harvest. Survival was never guaranteed. Yet, despite these hardships, peasants found ways to build communities, preserve culture, and resist oppression. Their legacy is woven into the very fabric of modern society, from land rights to labor laws, from cultural traditions to ideas of justice and fairness. Understanding their true experience helps us appreciate not only the progress we've made, but also the human capacity to endure and adapt. It challenges us to reconsider nostalgic views of the past and recognize the value of the freedoms and comforts we often take for granted today. So next time you hear someone say, "Life was better in the Middle Ages," remember the facts. Life was different, yes, but often worse for the vast majority. The medieval peasant story is a powerful reminder of how far humanity has come and how much more work remains to create a fairer, healthier, and freer world. Thank you for joining me on this exploration of medieval peasant life. If you found this video insightful, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts below. What surprised you most about medieval peasants? Let's continue the conversation.